Hello everyone, welcome to the 19th lecture of this massive open online course on philosophical foundations of social research. As you know uh, that we are in the 7th week of this course, we are discussing the controversies between positivism on the one hand and hermeneutics on the other, I mean phenomenological sociology on the other. And we have already discussed positivism versus hermeneutics in the context of natural sciences versus social sciences, and we have already discussed this, and we are going to discuss these two parameters, I mean objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences and quantitative and qualitative research traditions. Okay. We have discussed hermeneutics in terms of meaningful human action, how Dilthey suggested that, or Dilthey argued that there is a marked difference between the study of nature on the one hand and the study of human action on the other. That is why Dilthey suggested that to study human action must involve two methods. That is why we have already discussed this. I mean in the first, the focus was on the relationship of the creator of an act, a book or a picture to the interpreter, and the interpreter understands by putting herself or himself in the position of the author or the creator. Understanding is possible because both share a common humanity, or in another formulation because they are both expressions of the spirit. And in the second method, what Dilthey argued that Dilthey argued that the characteristics of individuals are disregarded. Instead, hermeneutics understands human action in relation to some wider whole which gives it meaning. For example, a painting is understood by reference to the outlook or worldview of the society in which it is a problem. Right? Similarly, the analyst can construct such a worldview out of its individual manifestations, and this circular relationship between a whole and its parts is known as a hermeneutic circle. We have discussed this. Then we have discussed how Mannheim posited individual and cultural manifestations as part of a larger worldview, documented a meaning to human actions. There was no intention but worldview, and he took a more positivistic stance. That is why he said all knowledge except scientific knowledge is socially and culturally conditioned. On the contrary, what we today know, that no, all knowledge including scientific knowledge is socially caused. That is why there was a critique of positivism in sociology, human actions caused by social structures, how to validate that, and hermeneutic circle, as we have already discussed. We have already discussed Gadamer's part and whole, interpreter and author, fusion of horizons, and how interpretations are always tentative. Interpretations cannot be completely accurate. That is why interpretations are always tentative. We have discussed phenomenological sociology. We have discussed Berger and Luckman and a critique, and then Suze's phenomenological sociology, and then we have discussed Weberian Verstehen, I mean critique of positivist or naturalist sociology. We cannot understand society if we feel that if we keep ourselves outside the purview of our economy, culture and polity. Verstehen is not based on natural sciences. It always talks about individual social actions, not simply individual social actions, but those actions must attach certain meanings. I mean actions, when I say action, there must be meaningful social action, and there must be cognitive empathy, I mean understanding the need of the other, understanding the role of the other, and thereby we tend to have multiple interpretations. In Weberian term, it is interpretation of interpretations, and a critique also we have discussed. How sociologists have argued that there is no way of validating Verstehen interpretations, and it has also been suggested that the attempt to reconcile causal and Verstehen analysis, I mean positivistic and neo-Kantian positions, or positivistic and phenomenological or hermeneutics analysis, actually ends up by denying the actor's point of view. And In this lecture, today's lecture, what we are going to do? We are going to discuss we are going to debate the controversies surrounding positivism on the one hand and hermeneutics or phenomenological sociology on the other through two more parameters. One is objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences, and the relationship between or the distinction between quantitative and qualitative research traditions. But ultimately we will see whether these distinctions are tenable, whether these distinctions can be sustained or not. We will see. Okay. Prima facie, when I say objectivity when I say objectivity, it comes under positivistic tradition, okay, and when I say subjectivity, it comes under hermeneutic tradition. Okay. Okay. The goal of when I say objectivity, the goal of scientific investigation, maybe sociological or otherwise, is often said to be objective knowledge, and that scientific investigation, when I said that whether sociological or otherwise, is often said to be objective knowledge free of bias and prejudice. Okay. There is a division of opinion here, some holding that objectivity in sociology is possible and others suggest that no, objectivity in social sciences is not possible. Objectivity in social sciences in general and objectivity in sociology in particular is not possible. And some people, some scholars, they also argue that objectivity in social sciences in general and in sociology in particular is not only not possible, but also not desirable. Okay. We will come to this point. Okay. Under what circumstances scholars, they suggest that no, it is impossible to have maintain objectivity in social sciences, in sociology, it is not simply it is not simply impossible to maintain objectivity in social sciences, but it is also not desirable to maintain objectivity in social sciences. Under what circumstances? 5 different kinds of arguments are advanced for social sciences in general and sociology in particular not being objective. Okay. The first one is phenomenological sociology, that we have already discussed. Sociological judgments, social science judgments are subjective, being colored by actors' own experiences. Okay. That is phenomenological sociology. Okay. That is why I said all, if I have to look at actors' own experiences, then I will always say that my experience will be different from your experience will different from somebody else's experience, and so on. Okay. That is why sociological judgments are subjective in nature. Okay. Being colored by actors' own experiences, that is phenomenological sociology. Secondly, when I say ethnomethodology or indexicality, all propositions are limited to their meaning, all propositions are limited to their meaning to particular language contexts. Okay. Ethnomethodology is nothing but people's methods propounded by Harold Garfinkel, okay, within the symbolic interactionist approaches, I mean microsociological approaches. And indexicality implies that ethnomethodologists argue that all actions and utterances are indexical. If our all actions are indexical, utterances are indexical, that is, they depend for their meaning on the context. It may be the context of language, it may be the context of nationality, it may be the context of region, it may be the context of religion, and so on. Okay. When I said ethnomethodologists argue that all actions and utterances are indexical, that is, they depend for their meaning on the context in which they occur. This feature implies that actors will normally make sense of actions and utterances of others by referring to their context. An activity which requires work, even if unconscious, particularly as each context is unique. If you that's why context determines the content, not the other way around. Okay? Each context is unique. If somebody asks you that what is the context of India's freedom struggle? What is the context of Cuban Revolution? What is the context of the French Revolution? What is the context of the Industrial Revolution? What is the context of the October Revolution, I mean Russian Revolution? These contexts vary. As our contexts vary, then our approaches should also vary. That is why it is the objective that determines our methods, not the other way around. Okay? That is what we have already discussed in, I mean, when we were discussing empiricism, rationalism, Popper, Kuhn and others, that the purpose of such kind of historical survey is to make a point that there cannot be any straitjacketed methods of science, rather it is the objective, it is the purpose, it is the intention that should determine what kind of methods that we are going to adapt. Thirdly, I mean if you look at this, the third one, Mannheim relativism, that all sociological theories are produced by and limited to particular social groups, specific social groups. Okay? Such a doctrine, that when I said all sociological theories are produced by and limited to specific social groups, in other words, such a doctrine is often taken to be an outcome of the sociology of knowledge, Mannheimian position, relativistic position, that which treats all knowledge as a function of social location. Okay? Social groups, social location. That is why knowledge is not absolute, knowledge is relative. Okay? Fourthly, all observations are necessarily theory laden. That is what observations are not theory free, rather observations are theory dependent or theory laden. Empiricists argued, positivists argued that no, observations are pure, in the sense that observations lead to theory generation, but the converse is not true. In other words, theories are dependent on observations, whereas observations are theory independent. But Popper and rationalists, we have already discussed how they suggested that no observation is theory free. There is nothing called presuppositionless observation. Okay? Observations are always theory laden for rationalists, for Popper and so on. And finally, a critique that has emerged that's very important. That's what is going to take more time in this lecture. The fifth one, value freedom, value neutrality, and value relevance. In that, all members of society have different values. Sociologists will unconsciously but necessarily have their arguments influenced by their values. Some sociologists argue that objectivity in all of these five senses, phenomenological sociology, ethnomethodology, indexicality, Mannheimian position, relativism, Popperian position, rationalism, or value freedom, value neutrality, and value relevance, you will find that then in all of these senses, the objectivity is not necessarily desirable. They suggest that the sociologist, for example, should be critical and espouse particular values. Yet others argue that objectivity in sociology is both possible and desirable. Positions here range from the claim that sociology is like natural science and objectivity can be protected by open debate and the use of rigorous methods, to more complex arguments like those of Weber, who argues for the position of value relevance. Okay? Now, we will go one by one, value freedom, then we will discuss value, we will first discuss value freedom, then value neutrality, and then value relevance. When you come to value freedom in sociology, this has a variety of meanings. Sociology can successfully exclude ideological or non-scientific assumptions from research. Okay? This is a position, okay, in favor of objectivity, in favor of positivism. Okay? Then sociologists should not make evaluative judgments about empirical evidence. Value judgments should be restricted to the sociologist's area of technical competence. Sociologists are indifferent to the moral implications of their research. Sociologists should make their own values open and clear, and sociologists should refrain from advocating particular values. This is a more positivistic position, this is a more objective position that is being propounded, okay, by the proponents of positivism, by the proponents who suggest that no, objectivity is possible, objectivity is desirable in social science research. Okay. That is why value neutrality also assumes greater significance. While research topics, approaches, and perspectives are selected according to the criterion of value relevance, which we will discuss a little while later, social science is not in a social sciences are not in a privileged position to pronounce social values, because there is a logical gap between empirical evidence and moral actions. Okay? This is important. That is why I said the social sciences are not in a privileged position to pronounce social values precisely because there is a logical gap between empirical evidence and moral actions. Empirical discoveries about the nature of poverty, inequality or suicide, for example, do not tell us what we ought to do. It is, I mean, prescriptive, okay, normatively what we should do. It is consequently argued that sociologists have to strive for value neutrality with respect to research and policy formation, and value neutrality operates at two levels, at the personal level and at the institutional level. At a personal level, sociologists should make clear their own values, and secondly at an institutional level, sociologists should not use their professional status as teachers to dictate values to students. There are three objections to this conventional account. Despite personal declarations of neutrality, values may unwittingly obtrude in research. One, these objections are very important, okay, that if you look at that obtrusion in research. Secondly, it is not clear that neutrality even in principle is possible. Perhaps suppose in the case of, in certain cases perhaps absolute neutrality is a myth. Let me give you an example. I hope all of you know sati, that people used to, I mean, sati was absolutely practiced in Indian socio-cultural milieu some 200 years back or so, but today also in some parts of the country they practice, but it is absolutely unethical and illegal. In the case of sati, sociologists, social scientists, they are not expected to maintain neutrality. In the case of farmer suicide, one is not expected to maintain neutrality. Okay? In this kind of thing, it is not possible, even in principle, to maintain neutrality. Secondly, it is not always evidence that value neutrality is desirable. On some questions, nobody should be neutral. That is why I said it is not simply impossible to maintain neutrality, but it is also not desirable to maintain neutrality, okay, in this sense. Okay. When we discuss, when we are going to discuss value relevance, we are going back to Max Weber's position. I mean, in Weber's discussion on philosophy of social science, there is a definite but complex distinction between value judgment and value interpretation. Value judgment and value interpretation. As social scientists, as social scientists, sociologists have to avoid making ad hoc personal value judgments on social phenomena, and in particular they are not in a position to recommend courses of action by suggesting that their recommendations are necessary and inevitable deductions from objective facts. However, given that Weber thought sociology involved the interpretative understanding of social action, okay, interpretation depends upon value interpretation, okay, because the way we tend to interpret a particular event, okay, a particular phenomenon, okay, values are closely embedded in these interpretations. Okay. The values of a social scientist determine which questions will be asked in any inquiry, which topics questions are important, which questions will be posed in any inquiry, which topics will be selected for investigation, and which methods that we are going to deploy to gather data. For Weber, value relevance operates at three levels. One is philological interpretation, secondly ethical interpretation, and thirdly rational interpretation. What are these? There is when I said philological interpretation, that establishes the meaning of, when I say philological interpretation, I mean that establishes meaning of texts and documents. Okay. When I say ethical interpretation, I mean I tend to assign a value to an object of inquiry. When I say rational interpretation, there is rational interpretation in which the sociologist seeks meaningful relationship between phenomena in terms of causal relationship. Or causal or you can say causal analysis. Okay? I mean cause and effect relationship, or there must be explanation. Let us go one by one. Philological interpretation, when I say, there is philological interpretation which establishes the meaning of texts and documents. There is ethical interpretation in assigning a value to an object of inquiry, and there is also rational interpretation in which the sociologist seeks the meaningful relationship between phenomena, okay, in terms of causal analysis. The point of value interpretation is to establish the values towards which an activity is directed. It is not to judge such activities as either good or bad. And therein lies the significance of a counter argument which has been posed in contradistinction with objectivity, that is namely subjectivity. Okay? When we say subjectivity, we look at consciousness, agency, personhood, reality and truth, social mode, I mean whether something is whether objectivity or subjectivity can be maintained or not, that has to be historically conditioned, that has to be historically integrated. Individuation, I mean the process of socialization, culture, living totality of living totality of subjectivity, culture shock and so on. Subjectivity is a central philosophical concept related to consciousness, agency, personhood, reality and truth. Subjectivity is an inherently social mode that comes about through innumerable interactions within society. As much as subjectivity is a process of individuation, it is equally a process of socialization. The individual never being isolated in a self-contained environment, but endlessly engaging in interaction with the surrounding world. And culture is a living totality of subjectivity at any given society, constantly undergoing transformation. See, that's why I always give this example to students, that culture is not static, culture is pretty dynamic. Culture, why it's very dynamic, please try to understand that people very often say that no, it's not our culture or their culture, or people very often take an ethnocentric approach, which is absolutely unethical, illegal, that people say that our culture is superior to others' culture or something. That's wrong. Okay? Culture cannot be measured, culture should not be evaluated, you cannot compare cultures. It's unethical when I say culture. Culture is not like a tree. Once a tree is uprooted, it dies. Culture is like a stream that flows from one generation to another. That's why it's very important to understand culture, that when I say living totality of subjectivity of any given society, constantly undergoing change, constantly undergoing transformation and so on, transition, that you will find that it's a process through which we not only accept, or we not only follow certain cultures, but we also constantly revise our cultures, we update, we try to negate a few parts of culture, because it's also about when I say culture, I mean it's it's also about acceptability, relevance, and I mean when you say certain traits of a particular culture may not be relevant after 100 years, may not be acceptable by the community of practitioners after 100 years, may not remain elegant after 100 years. Culture changes. Okay? And once culture, I mean that's why I said culture is I mean when I say culture is a living totality of subjectivity at any given society, at any given economy, culture and polity, constantly undergoing transition, transformation and so on. And hence subjectivity is both shaped by it and shapes it in turn, but also by other things like the economy, political institutions, communities, as well as the natural world. Okay. Though the boundaries of societies and their cultures are indefinable and arbitrary, the subjectivity inherent in each one is palatable and can be recognized in distinct or I mean that's why I said though the boundaries of societies and their cultures are indefinable or and arbitrary, the subjectivity inherent in each one is palatable and can be recognized as distinct from others. Subjectivity in part is a particular experience or organization of reality, which includes how one views and interacts with humanity, objects, consciousness and nature. So, the difference between different cultures brings about an alternate experience of existence that forms life in a different manner. A common effect on an individual of this disjunction between subjectivities is nothing but culture shock. That is why I repeat, a common effect of a common effect on an individual of this disjunction between subjectivities is culture shock, where the subjectivity of the other culture is considered alien and possibly incomprehensible or even hostile. And that is how you tend to compare cultures, which is wrong. Okay? That is why people very often say that our culture is superior to others' culture, our food pattern is superior to others' food pattern. See, food is always a cultural activity, it is not a religious activity. Okay? Culture is a very broader term, religion is a part of culture, culture is not a part of religion, right? Religion is a part of culture. Okay? And food, the way we take our food is never a religious activity, it is always a cultural activity. But those who try to intertwine food with religion, actually that is not religion or something, but that is politics as such. Okay? Then we'll now move on to one more. This is the last parameter through which we want to discuss we want to debate the controversies between positivism on the one hand and hermeneutic studies and phenomenological sociology on the other. Okay? That is quantitative and qualitative research traditions. If you look at this, please do not think that these distinctions are absolute or something. These distinctions are also equally relative, but for the time being you think that they are absolute, but we will discuss a little while later what is the problem in making this kind of crude distinction. Okay? The basis of the first column suggests the basis of comparison, and the second column suggests quantitative research, and the third column suggests qualitative research. What is the meaning of quantitative research? The meaning is to generate, I mean, numerical, I mean, what is the meaning? I mean, it is based on numerical, quantitative research is based on numerical data and facts by employing statistical, logical and mathematical techniques. On the contrary, qualitative research is about how to understand human and social sciences to find the way people think and feel. Quantitative research is based on positivism, whereas qualitative research is based on hermeneutics tradition, or you can say phenomenological sociology. Okay? Okay? Or Verstehen method. Then when you look at this, that quantitative research is based on numerical data, hard facts by employing statistical, logical and mathematical models, mathematical techniques, okay, of data collection. Qualitative research suggests that no, we must try to understand human and social world to find the way in which people tend to think, people tend to feel. What is the nature of quantitative research? The nature of quantitative research is very much particularistic in nature, in approach, whereas the nature of qualitative research is pretty holistic in character. Okay? The approach that quantitative research undertakes is objective in nature, whereas the approach that qualitative research undertakes is quite subjective in nature. Okay? That is why I said, I mean if you look at particularistic, holistic, objectivity, subjectivity, I mean when you tend to generate numbers, okay, then you are speaking about a particular local, particular phenomenon and so on. But when you look at qualitative research, it provides us with a larger world to make a claim. The approach, when I said that quantitative research is objective, whereas qualitative research is subjective in nature, I mean quantitative research tends to aim at objectivity, tends to aim at neutrality, value free, whereas qualitative research suggests that no, the research is always value laden. That is why I mean qualitative research always suggests that no, it is not simply possible to, it is not simply not possible to maintain objectivity, but also not desirable to maintain objectivity. Okay? But the proponents of quantitative research suggest that no, it is not only possible, but also desirable to maintain objectivity. That is the thing. And thereby, if they, when they want to try to, I mean, when the proponents of quantitative research try to make their research very conclusive, okay, the proponents of qualitative research suggest that no, research must be exploratory in nature. Okay? Okay? In research, you cannot say that this is the conclusion. Okay? Absolute conclusion is a myth in qualitative research. When you look at sampling, quantitative research always starts with random sampling, whereas qualitative research starts with purposive sampling, alternatively known as theoretical sampling. Okay? In quantitative research, data are measurable, data can be calculated, data can be measured, you can look at validity and reliability of the data. Okay? You can examine the validity and reliability of the data in quantitative research. In qualitative research, data are dependent on verbal communication, oral tradition, archival research and so on. The inquiry, that is, I mean, that is why I said a research type is conclusive in quantitative research. That is why, as it is conclusive, it is much oriented to results, but qualitative research is more oriented towards processes. Okay. In quantitative research, a hypothesis, that is a tentative solution to a problem or hunch, is often tested. In qualitative research, hypotheses are generated. If you look at the elements of analysis in quantitative research, we tend to have numerical data. In qualitative research, we tend to have words, pictures and objects of inquiry. What is the objective? No, the objective of quantitative research to provide a causal relationship, to provide an explanation, to provide a cause and effect relationship. On the contrary, the objective of qualitative research is to explore and discover ideas. The methods, I mean the questionnaire methods, if you look at that questionnaire, if you prepare questionnaire interview schedule in research, you will find that the methods that quantitative research deploys, it is a structured questionnaire method, whereas qualitative research designs non-structured interview schedules. The result that quantitative research aims for is a final course of action, and on the contrary, qualitative research develops initial understanding about human and social sciences to find the way in which people tend to think and feel. In this sense, we have tried to look at controversies between positivism on the one hand and phenomenological sociology or hermeneutics on the other, in terms of natural sciences and social sciences, objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences, and quantitative and qualitative research traditions. I mean, positivism, always positivism is based on natural sciences, aims at objectivity, aims at neutrality and so on, and positivism tends to generate numerical data. Whereas hermeneutics is based on social sciences, hermeneutics, I mean phenomenological sociology aims at subject, I mean always suggests that no, this is just this world is not objective, this world is absolutely subjective in nature. There must be a marked difference between the study of nature on the one hand and the study of human action on the other, and human action cannot be absolutely objective in nature. As you know, human action must be very subjective in nature, and hence phenomenological sociology, I mean hermeneutics tradition is based on qualitative research traditions. Okay? That is why And that is why I tried to provide this kind of distinction between positivism and hermeneutics in terms of these three parameters, namely natural sciences on the one hand, social sciences on the other one, secondly objectivity on the one hand and subjectivity in social sciences on the other, and thirdly quantitative research tradition on the one hand and qualitative research traditions on the other. Okay. Now, before winding it up, okay, I want to make a very serious comment on this, that please do not think that there is absolute crude distinction between natural sciences and social sciences, or objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences, or quantitative and qualitative research traditions. Please try to understand that there must be a dialectical relationship between natural sciences on the one hand and social sciences on the other. There must also be a dialectical relationship between objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences, and there must also be a dialectical relationship between quantitative and qualitative research. In other words, there must be a dialectical relationship between positivistic philosophy as well as phenomenological sociology. I mean that there must be a dialectical relationship between these two. You just cannot, in research, we cannot have an opinion that no, we will just go ahead with one parameter, we will go ahead with only one perspective. We live in a world of multiple perspectives. Multiculturalism is the ethos of world outlook that we must have, one must have. That when I said why there must be a dialectical, there is a dialectical relationship between natural sciences and social sciences, or objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences, or quantitative and qualitative research traditions. Let me give you an example. If I say that I want to frame the literacy policy in India, I want to see, I want to examine, or the state wants to do that literacy policy. How are you going to, how does the state do this? How does the government do this? If I do not know the number of illiterates in the country, how can I frame the literacy policy? Suppose I want to check population growth in India. I want to understand population policy. How does the government, or how can the government frame population policy without knowing the number of population, without knowing the demographic profile of the country? That is why the distinction between quantitative and qualitative research techniques or traditions is not rigid, is in fact porous, is opaque. You just the porousness of such distinction must be understood. The porousness of the distinction between natural sciences and social sciences must be understood. The distinction between or the porousness of the distinction between objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences must be explained, must be understood. What is objective may not be objective, may not remain objective for all time to come. That is why I said whether it is objective or subjective, they are historically conditioned. They must be examined in certain specific locale. That is very important. Okay. In this sense, what we are trying to do, we are trying to go beyond the narrow confinements of the distinction between natural sciences and social sciences, objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences, quantitative and qualitative research traditions, and so on. Okay. We must go beyond the narrow confinements of such distinction. We must try to integrate natural sciences with social sciences. We must try to integrate quantitative and qualitative research traditions, and so on. Because research cannot be reduced to only one viewpoint. Research must take into account the various viewpoints, various perspectives at hand. Okay? That is why I always say that research cannot be reduced to only one view, because having a single view will make you more authoritarian in nature. Okay? And in this sense, we have discussed the controversies between positivism and hermeneutics. If you then what have we discussed in the seventh week? In the seventh week, we have discussed the controversies between or we have discussed the distinction between positivism on the one hand and phenomenological sociology on the other, or hermeneutics on the other. We have discussed these differences, these distinctions on the basis of three parameters. One, natural sciences versus social sciences. Two, objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences. And three, quantitative and qualitative research traditions. And in terms of natural sciences versus social sciences, we have looked into Dilthey's reflections on this on the distinction between study of nature on the one hand and study of human action on the other. Mannheimian position we have discussed Gadamer's position, we have discussed phenomenological sociology, we have discussed Berger and Luckman's position, Suge's phenomenological sociology, Weberian Verstehen, objectivity and subjectivity we have discussed, I mean in terms of scientific investigation, in terms of free of bias and prejudice, and the critique of such reflections in terms of phenomenological sociology, ethnomethodology and indexicality, Mannheimian position, Popper, I mean relativism, rationalism, and in terms of value freedom, value neutrality, and value relevance. And then we have discussed subjectivity in terms of consciousness, agency, personhood, reality and truth, social mode, individuation, as well as a process of socialization, culture as representing a living totality of subjectivity at any given society, constantly undergoing transformation, and how subjectivity is both shaped by it and shapes it in turn, but also by other things like economy, like the economy, political institutions, communities, as well as the natural world. And though the boundaries of societies and their cultures are indefinable and arbitrary, the subjectivity inherent in each one is palatable and can be recognized as distinct from others. Subjectivity in part is a particular experience or organization of reality, which includes how one views and interacts with humanity, objects, consciousness and nature. So, the difference between different cultures brings about an alternate experience of existence that forms life in a different manner. A common effect on an individual of this disjunction between subjectivities is nothing but culture shock, which the subjectivity of the other culture is considered alien and possibly incomprehensible or even hostile. And then we have tried to make a distinction between quantitative and qualitative research traditions in terms of meaning, approach, meaning, nature, approach, research type, sampling, data, inquiry, hypothesis, elements of analysis, objective methods, result, reasoning and so on. Okay. And having discussed this, we have also tried to demonstrate how there is a dialectical relationship, or perhaps these distinctions between natural sciences and social sciences, between objectivity and subjectivity in social research, or the distinctions between quantitative and qualitative research, they are not tenable, they are not sustainable, such distinctions are not sustainable. Perhaps there is a and we must try to understand the dialectical relationship between these phenomena, dialectical relationship between natural sciences and social sciences, dialectical relationship between quantitative and qualitative research traditions, dialectical relationship between objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences. I mean, we must understand the porousness of the distinction between these three parameters, and then in the in the next week, I mean that will be the last week of this course. In the next week, in terms of 2 lectures, I mean in the 8th week, in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to discuss beginning of the end of philosophy of social sciences, and then then from there we will start overview of the course. Thank you.